First of all, I'd like to say my sincere thanks and appreciation to the organisers of the tribunal and the members of the tribunal for your hard work in bringing this together. And I also want to convey my thanks for inviting me to participate and being asked to support your deliberations. As was made very clear at the beginning of the session by Dr. Zani, it's not my right to make detailed representations about the experiences of individuals, and my colleagues and friends from the Kachin community here in the UK will be perfectly able to do that more eloquently than I do, and they have the right to do that while I do not. So the kind of representation that I would like to make is really to try to describe the context in which a lot of this violence is situated.
Mandy, could you speak up a bit? This microphone is actually for the webcast.
Ah, okay.
So I think if the panel in particular have trouble hearing what's going on here. So
if my voice drops, just wave at me and I'll speak up
yeah,
again.
so it's a bit of a boom now.
Okay. So I'm a historian, and so my main objective is really to try and explain what is the historical context in which the state feels even capable of justifying this violence. And that kind of understanding filters into a wider Burmese understanding that what is being done on their behalf as well. So there are particular historical conditions that have created this situation. So it's that I shall try to explain to the best of my ability. And I prepared about 15 or 20 minutes to describe this context to you. I also believe it's very significant that this is one of the first occasions in which representatives and members of one of the largest of the groups, the non-Burmese groups from Myanmar, have chosen to ally their struggle with that of the Rohingya people. It seemed to many that while there's been a lot of criticism of the new government and of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi in particular for failing to speak out about the abuses that have been reported and documented among the Rohingya peoples by members of the armed forces and the rising levels of racist violence that have been seen in Western Myanmar, the voices of many of the ethnic armed organisations have also remained relatively silent on this issue. While obviously their voices have been raised in their own cause, few, if any, have made explicit connections between their own experiences and the oppression of the Rohingya people. The prejudice that Rohingya people face in Myanmar is not the exclusive prerogative of Burmese people, the Burmese government, and the Burmese military. Anyone who's been involved in these issues over an extended time will be aware of the difficulties that many groups and leaders from across the national spectrum feel in engaging openly about the repression of the Rohingya people. This is a deep-rooted racial prejudice that is pervasive and destructive. Today, therefore, it's significant, as was noted at the beginning, that representatives and members of one of the main non-Burmese communities are prepared to stand alongside Rohingya people and declare that the oppression that they both experience is shared. This is a vitally important aspect of this tribunal, and it's very important, in my view, that the panel and the tribunal as a whole adheres as much as possible to the principle of extending this frame of reference and of inclusion. It will take not only for the Burmese military and Burmese government to amend their attitudes, but for far broader constituencies within Myanmar to speak out against the violence that is being experienced by all parties. There is a view that trying to link these events and to make connections between the Rohingya and the Kachin experiences is a mistake, and that's been noted to me already. It may bring with it the jeopardy that it confuses distinct problems that need to be approached and understood on their own terms. At worst, such an endeavour might even harm the interests of those involved by creating confusion. These are not trivial concerns, and the jury and organisers of the tribunal obviously need to be alert to this possibility and any unintended outcomes, as I'm sure you are. However, this tribunal is directed towards understanding and assessing the common structure that connects these issues and experiences, the role of the Myanmar state and its armed forces. The ideological drivers that produce violence in one area share a common heritage that may produce or reflect violence in other areas. The strategies and tactics that are rehearsed in one arena may be deployed in other arenas. This, in my view, justifies bringing together a critique of these strategies and tactics to understand how that underlying structure functions. The need then, as noted, is to expand the frame of reference further, rather than to exceptionalise the experiences of the Kachin and the Rohingya as this tribunal proceeds. All those who are oppressed for their racial, ethnic or religious identities in Myanmar in fact occupy a common and shared political space, which has been constructed through decades of development of a xenophobic, militarised nationalism. It's clearly not the case that all Burmese people are full of hate for the many and diverse peoples who inhabit the shared borders of the country as a whole. Local areas are often complex in their ethnic and religious composition. The interaction of many communities is historical, long-standing, and deep. The origins of that particular strain of nationalism lie in the perpetuation of the narrative of internal and external threat that emerged out of traumatic experiences wrought upon the older Burmese state by colonialism. That expression of threat, that there are internal forces determined upon the destruction of the Burmese state from within and from without, and especially that those internal and external forces may join in collaboration together, has been the driving nationalist narrative since independence. It is based upon the belief that opportunities were laid upon the table at the point of independence, the victorious post-colonial moment, and that those opportunities were snatched away by hostile internal and external forces. It might reasonably be argued that what had emerged ideologically in the Myanmar state under military rule was a nationalism, therefore, that was rooted in ideas of threat and vulnerability. The nationalist anti-colonial movement before independence was predicated on the notion that colonial rule had fatally undermined the integrity of Burmese Buddhist society, which it was now the job of Burmese nationalists to restore. Burmese nationalism developed with a clear sense of its own purpose in defining the authentic core of the independent nation. Yet this never led to a clear articulation of how those who were neither Burmese nor Buddhist might fit into this nation on equal terms. The notion, as many of you will know already, of the Panglong spirit as a myth of harmony later went on to replace serious engagement with issues of political and economic discrimination. Indeed, one could argue that there was never any discussion of this equality because it was not, in fact, ever assumed that there should be equality. The nationalist ideology of the new Burmese state, especially as it became entrenched under military rule, was not based upon the notion of social inclusion, but of mainly securing Burmese Buddhist identity at its core against the endless threats, both internal and external, that seemed determined to undermine or possibly even destroy it. When the army came to power, it did so almost entirely on the basis of protecting the Burmese Buddhist nation from further experiences of control by powers that sought to destroy it. However, various groups within the country were also associated with this hostile outside, even though they were inside. These included those whose ancestry was from people deemed not to have been indigenous to the country before the start of British colonial intervention in 1823, even though the borders of the nation, even though the borders of the modern state were very different to that time. Mainly, this marginalised and in many cases victimised those of South Asian and Chinese ancestry, all of which communities had in fact had extensive and deep historical relations with the Burmese kingdoms over many centuries. The experience of large-scale Asian transmigration that accompanied Western imperial expansion across South and Southeast Asia was given a politically charged meaning in relation to the rights of communities to gain citizenship in the independent Myanmar state following the military takeover. Other proxies for foreign intervention and the undermining of the Burmese Buddhist state were those groups in armed opposition to the military regime. In some cases, those groups, where they were Buddhists, as in the case of the Shan or the Mon, were deemed prone geographically to influence from outside because of their borderland location, and frequently their histories of autonomous statehood in their own right made the Burmese state feel vulnerable. In what had been the frontier areas, where there had been some conversion to Christianity during the colonial period, These different religious beliefs, which the military regime distrusted because they were, according to them, a colonial-era legacy, came to represent how these communities were labouring under false and misguided notion of their relationship to the modern nation of Burma. The military government argued that Christian minorities had learned a sense of difference from Burma, from disruptive missionary forces, facilitated by colonial experience. The local narratives that rather drove this conversion were entirely lost and still remain largely absent. Foreign missionaries were therefore banned. It did little to stem the tide of conversion, which in most cases took place mainly in the context of civil war in the post-independence era. Again, a fact that seems to have been entirely overlooked in most narratives of these issues. The main way of dealing with the communities who also supported these armed others within was through developing a cultural and an education system that placed Buddhist Burmese culture and language at its centre, no matter the ethnic and religious self-identities of the students. And the ongoing problems within the education system also reflect this longer history. As the Panglong Agreement morphed into the Panglong Spirit, this did not extend in any way to recognition of forms of multiculturalism as a component of the independent state, other than mainly for cultural display. This is the historical space that both the Kachin people and the Rohingya people share. On the one hand, the Kachin people have become associated with the idea that they were the allies of that destructive colonial force that devastated Burma and subverted its history. They were the puppets of colonial masters who had mistaken loyalties, and these narratives are still perpetuated today. This narrative continues to mask any proper discussion of valid political aspirations and the ways in which Kachin communities and others have shared histories too of anti-colonialism and colonial oppression. For the Rohingya people, the space they inhabit is also part of this same narrative of the invading foreigner from South Asia who is part of the colonial vision that destroyed Burma. This is often the way that these forces of oppression validate their actions as a kind of national salvation, even today. But in keeping her silence on these issues, Aung San Suu Kyi seems not to recognise that she herself occupies this same space with the Rohingya and with the Kachin and with others oppressed by fear of the other. The reason why she was denied the presidency is a result of exactly this narrative that demonises the Rohingya and the Kachin. The fear of the foreign and the colonial and the latent forces of disturbance and disruption that are deemed to lie merely waiting for their moment to seize power in Burma again and render it to powerlessness in the face of stronger forces. Her own marriage to a foreigner is part of that same space leading to her exclusion from the presidency. Yet she was able to use her power to navigate this space more effectively in her own interests. For Aung San Suu Kyi, the issue of the problem created by this history was resolved by reclaiming that post-colonial moment. She inserted herself back into the national narrative at the point at which her father was cut from history. She reclaims his authority as a moral lineage of Burmese military heritage. She resumes the flawed Panglong Conference as a means of asserting her own post-colonial moment, but one which, again, as in the first Panglong Conference, was heavily weighted against any real political movement to resolve how modern Burma should become a multicultural, tolerant, and diverse state, rather than one in which a chauvinistic nationalism defines all the agendas. It is a shift that it seems Aung San Suu Kyi was not aware that she would have to make so directly and explicitly when she came to power. In the concluding sentence of my book, published in 2013, if you forgive me as I quote it, it says, "To make the current conflicts the final manifestation of violence will require a mammoth effort of listening and engagement of the kind that the Burmese Centre has yet to experience. It will require Burmese national politicians with the intellectual and ideological capacity and willingness to occupy a space in Burmese political life that no Burmese politician has yet occupied." This was the hope that many communities had when the NLD won their landslide. That, at the very least, she would listen to their concerns. At a basic level, this has produced the situation that we have today, with the tribunal being convened. At a basic level, this tribunal is also an attempt to try and force people to listen. Do you want me to stop? Okay. Okay.
I think it's okay.
Yeah, okay. So the desire is for to get her to listen, basically. And at a fundamental level, this is also what we're trying to do. It's about listening. Then maybe this can lead to the end of violence, but actually the need to listen has yet to actually be instated. The lack of a clearly elucidated plan on the part of the NLD about how to make progress in resolving the country's ethnic and religious conflicts reflects that these issues of conflict are deep-rooted in the politics and history of the country. Burmese politicians of all persuasions seem to be equally bereft of inspiration for how to negotiate a path to a peaceful and inclusive Myanmar state in which the hopes and aspirations of non-Burman and non-Buddhist communities would be protected. That currently redress of this issue is being approached through the symbolism of a highly contentious historical agreement and a Panglong conference for the 21st century, which itself was originally a secretive and a secretive political event, which ended simply by embedding a Burmano-Buddhist-centric solution in a political and economic system, is not lost on those who are now called upon to take the same leap of faith, this time with General Aung San's daughter. Part of the problem is that Burmese politicians of all persuasions seem so reluctant to elucidate a clear vision of what a modern, multi-ethnic and multi-faith Myanmar might look like, how its education system might be developed to promote inclusion and diversity, how economic and social inequalities might be addressed, and how a proper route to social reconciliation might be travelled. It's time to find new ways of talking about these issues in modern Myanmar that moves beyond the idea of Panglong conferences. Set against this general background, there are the particular histories and experiences of diverse, complex, and multifaceted communities. I've written extensively about how the national myth-making of what the Kachin ethno-nationalist movement is motivated by, typically a narrative that promotes the idea it is greed, political naivety, selfish and narrow political ambitions, and a historical orientation towards sympathy towards colonial oppressors rather than the Burmese state, has framed the analysis even down to the present. This has also influenced many of the international actors who are becoming involved in Burma in recent years, and why they seem to feel it is justified for them not to engage very fully with what's going on in the region. There is presently a feeling of abandon in the Kachin region in relation to the ongoing experience of violence exerted upon local communities. Many thousands of displaced people have, since 2011, been forced to flee to camps along the Kachin-Yunnan border region. And the perception that there is an intensification of the violence that state forces are prepared to use against Kachin civilians, and the utter neglect, even negligent dismissal of the significance of these issues among the international community is prevalent. To a large extent, it seems that the lack of engagement of the international community is because they too have bought into the idea that Aung San Suu Kyi has somehow set history back on course and reclaimed the post-colonial moment. Letting go of that narrative creates huge problems for many of them. The attitude is not only negligent of the serious abuses of state power by military forces that are taking place, it is also historically ignorant. It's historically ignorant because it completely fails to recognise that the Kachin region has on multiple occasions tried to engage positively and constructively with building the new nation. A few years after independence, the Kachin region was praised by the national government and by the national Burmese press for its willingness to become a part of the newly independent state and to play an active and supportive role within it. It was even declared that many of the many problems that were then facing the country, none of them could be laid at the door of the Kachin state. Then again in 1994, when the Slork government signed a ceasefire with the Kachin Independence Organization, it was heralded as a major coup for peace building and a sign that, yet again, the most northerly region of the country was prepared to put its trust in the national government to find solutions to outstanding difficulties and move towards a peaceful future together. The Kachin people tried to work around the promises and sense of hope for 17 years. As with a number of collaborators in my recent book, which has been submitted to the panel as part of the evidence, the experience of the ceasefire, which saw the extension of the power of the military state in the region, large-scale land grabs and environmental problems, combined with a lack of civic infrastructural development, an emerging sense of social crisis that developed into a model of the deliberate targeting of the Kachin region for special treatment, has fed into this local narrative that it may even be that there is an attempt to undermine Kachin youth to a degree that local forces are even prepared to see the widespread expansion of drug abuse and rapid rise in HIV rates as well. These are the kinds of narratives that are very much embedded locally and which have to be taken seriously as local perceptions of what is going on. Rather than focusing on the fact that the KIO will not sign a ceasefire at present, the more important question is to ask why they are refusing to sign a ceasefire at present. This reveals a great deal about the nature of the political settlements on offer, which are essentially about enforcing compliance to a government agenda rather than a shared set of political objectives. KIO refusal to enter a flawed ceasefire process again does not mean that you can blame the victims. Instead, you should ask, why is that experience so heartfelt that ordinary people in the Kachin region have stood so resolutely behind them in recent years as they have refused to comply? Most importantly, we should look at the response of this resistance by state forces and the escalation of violence that they are prepared to use. This brings us back to the purpose of this tribunal and the connections it seeks to make about violence in different arenas, but linked by common structures. It is vitally important that pressure is put on the current government of Myanmar to bring an end to the violence that is being perpetuated by the Myanmar military upon innocent civilians. We can see in the Rohingya case the extreme ends of violence against civilians. In the Kachin region, we can see in recent years and months a ratcheting up of the levels of state violence that is being carried out with apparent impunity. The direction of travel appears to be going in only one direction, and it is vitally important that the new government is held to account on these matters because the present trajectory suggests that the situation will otherwise deteriorate further. Beyond this, there is the much longer issue of how Myanmar will build a peaceful future in which different communities have been engaged in long-term conflict, often including intense violence with each other, learn to understand different perspectives, experiences, and to acknowledge the right to acclaim autonomy from homogenizing narratives of the Myanmar nation that fail to recognize alternative histories. The failure to bring to justice the perpetrators of crimes who carry out these crimes while wearing a national uniform is but a small step on what must be a very long road. But it is a critical step that will involve a massive ideological shift at the center of the country.
Thank you very much, Mandy. I think that was a very powerful contribution to understanding the situation of the Kachin, and I don't think it can be understated how significant this tribunal is in bringing together the Kachin with the Rohingya in terms of accusing the Myanmar state. I think this is a really historic moment and one we are very grateful for you to contribute toward.